So let me see how we're doing for time, Anne.
7 minutes.
I have 7 minutes left.
You have
7 minutes plus some more. Okay, good. I'll stop when I'm finished. So briefly, there's not much to say about the hyperactive impulsive cluster. Are there any parents here or people who live with TSC? How many of you or family members have had overactivity? So this is now the TAND checklist. Overactivity, hyperactivity, restlessness, or impulsivity. Yeah? Okay. Are you counting yourself? So these are the 3 items in that particular cluster. For those of you who are ADHD experts, you might notice that these are 3 of the key things that we often look for in ADHD: hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. But you will see that inattention is not actually in this cluster. Inattention groups with the neuropsychological stuff. So that's already an interesting separation at a practical level for us. But if we look at these phenomena in relation to intellectual ability, as I've shown you, people with TSC have a broad range. You can see, yes, if you have some degree of intellectual disability, you're very likely to have overactivity, restlessness, impulsivity. You can see here the rates are the majority, 50 to 70% of people with TSC with intellectual disability also have some of these. But even in those with completely normal intellectual ability, at least 1 in 3, at least a third, have some of these manifestations. And so the message is it's very common. It's very often not identified and thought about. But, and I hope Lucy will talk about it, we haven't coordinated, hyperactivity and impulsivity is a risk marker for lots of other things, particularly for dysregulated behaviors. Are you going to say that again? She will. So remember it. Phew. Okay. And so a practical suggestion about if you have phenomena in that cluster is to say, well, think about ADHD and do a proper diagnostic workup for ADHD. As you know, many people meet criteria. Most don't get a diagnosis because people would say, oh, it's just TSC. Oh, he's just a boy. Oh, he's going to grow out of this overactivity. They don't. They grow into it rather than out of it. And then there are a range of treatment options. So ADHD, if it's mild to moderate, international, certainly European guidelines at the moment would say that we would use behavioral and other approaches to help people develop attentional skills, classroom-based activities, occupational activities. And if it's severe, then we would actually add stimulant medication to the treatment plan. Never on its own, but add it to the treatment plan. Interestingly, often in TSC, people are scared to use stimulants because there's this theoretical concern about seizures and worsening seizures. But I've never seen a worsening of seizures on stimulant medication. Of course, you have to be careful with all the physical manifestations, etc. But the message to clinicians and to families is consider an assessment for ADHD and consider appropriate treatments for ADHD as well. I don't know how much of a problem it is here. Maybe in the discussion section we could talk about that. Many families ask us, well, what practical things can we do? And this is quite a good book. I don't get royalties from this. It's just a book that I've used in clinical practice by a woman called Sandra Reef. It's called How to Reach and Teach Children and Teens with ADHD or ADD. The term ADD is not a diagnostic one. It's not an ICD or DSM. But basically, kids who have attentional problems and or meet criteria for ADHD, which would be many with TSC. And they talk about classroom arrangements, how you can help kids practice not being fidgety and deal with those sorts of things and help increase attention span and all those sorts of practical things that I think are really the kind of activities that mums and dads are looking for. It works for adults and it works for husbands and wives too, just in case you're wondering. So let me now just spend the last few minutes a bit about the neuropsychological cluster. So this is the second one. So these are the items in the TAND checklist. And all of them except the last one cluster in that group. Memory, such as remembering things, attention difficulties, concentrating, dual tasking, the most common one of all, visuospatial difficulties, and executive difficulties, planning, set shifting, etc. And then plus difficulty paying attention. So if you see in clinic somebody who struggles paying attention and mum and dad says this is hard for them, think about what's happening at a neuropsychological level, because that might be the best level of explanation of these sorts of challenges. I don't know how many of you are experts on neuropsychology. I don't want to do the bit if you're We have a few neuropsychologists in the room. Good. Okay, good, good, good. So for the psychiatrists in the room, that might just be me, very simplistically, a neuropsychological approach tries to say we know where different aspects of learning and memory happen, and we can measure the strengths and weaknesses of the brain of an individual using a range of different evaluation tools. And very simplistically, we divide the brain up into front and back, left and right, inside and outside. Does that make sense? You can see I have to think simplistically about these things. And we know specialized, most of us have language skills specialized on the left, have visuospatial skills specialized towards the right, have information systems towards the back, have production or executive systems towards the front of the brain. And the up-down, the inside-outside is just about regulatory functions are very subcortical inside the brain, and the more knowledge-based systems are more cortical. Now, of course, our brains don't look like that. They're obviously networks and connections, and you've seen some of these beautiful pictures by Dr. Vries, so it's quite a complicated system, so I don't want to oversimplify it. But at a practical neuropsychological level, what we do is we evaluate all these different functional brain systems in a clinical setting with a neuropsychologist or a clinical psychologist, and we try to see whether people are affected what I call proportionately or disproportionately. So I'm going to pick a random person in the room. Who will be a random person in the room? Lisbeth. If I do an assessment on Lisbeth of her neuropsychological skills, I'm going to predict that all her, imagine these are little matchsticks, all her little matchsticks are all going to be pretty much the same length. So she's going to be as good in her memory skills as in her attentional skills, as in her language skills or whatever. But we know in many people who have genetic disorders, they might have mostly strengths and then a few areas of weakness. And unless we look at those, we're not going to pick these up. If I just take the average here, I'm not going to pick up those two guys. And this is the pattern that we see in people with TSC. Some things that are really good, some things that are really bad, some things that are average. And this is what mums and dads tell us. Well, he's very good at doing this, but he's rubbish at doing something else. And it's because the neuropsychological strengths and weaknesses are so disproportionately affected. And we cannot tell that from just looking at people and from just looking at their abilities. And so that's what we're trying to do. We evaluate their neuropsychological skills to try and get a sense of that profile. And the most common bits affected in TSC are in these, what we call anterior and subcortical functions, so-called executive processing skills. Memory is affected a lot as well, but attentional and executive skills are really the key challenges that we see in daily life. This is just another way to show some of those. We talk about regulatory mechanisms. I'm not going to go into the detail given my time. Attentional control mechanisms, and then these goal-directed mechanisms, and they are often very problematic. I've already said dual tasking. For most people with TSC, if you're going to have one deficit, this is the deficit you're likely to have, doing two things at the same time. So one of my mantras is all men and most people with TSC have dual tasking difficulties, right? It's a good way to remember it. Very common, often not evaluated, typically clinical psychologists or neuropsych people. They use a range of tools, and I've mentioned attention, memory, and then some of these executive skills. And I just wanted to make sure that you all understand what I mean by some of these. So maybe we have time, maybe we don't. The reason these are important, when we talk to people with TSC and when we evaluate them, they tell us that this is how it often manifests. You don't present with a neuropsychological deficit by sitting there and I can say, oh my goodness, you have an attentional deficit. But I can see that maybe you're struggling in school or getting in trouble, or you struggle in the workplace and inconsistencies, and you might appear stubborn and willful and deliberate, particularly when you have kind of inflexibility in your brain. You want things to be done in a particular way and you get upset if you can't. Very inconsistent and variable behavior. This is a very typical pattern in TSC. You can do it one day and the next day you can't. You can do it 1 week and the next week you can't. And then teachers get upset and they say, but you were able to do this last week. What's wrong this week? When in fact, that's part of the dysexecutive presentation of that person, or in fact, adult. We see it in adults as well. And often, when there's then a demand on the brain, people present with anxiousness or aggression, and it really can affect their relationships in major ways as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip all the games that I was going to make you do. I'm going to make you do at least one. Planning. Let's just do a little planning game and then I'll wrap up. Planning is the brain's ability to, we think about kind of memory as kind of knowledge of the past, and planning is knowledge about the future. In a way, and many people with TSC struggle with planning. So one of the simple games that we use is called the Tower of London. So you have to imagine that there's like a pegboard and little balls. And you can put the little balls on the peg. So here you can see at the bottom 2 pegs and a third one. And what we say to kids and to adults is to say, I want you to tell me how many moves do I need to make the bottom one look like the top one. You can only move one ball at a time. So what do you think do we need to do to make the bottom one look like the top one? I just take the blue one and I put it there, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's just one move, okay? Here's another one. How many moves do I need to make the bottom one look like the top one? Oh my goodness, this is supposed to be an easy one, people. So you can only move one ball at a time. So you probably have to move this one there, then that one there, then this one there. Does that make sense? 1, 2, 3 moves, okay? So here's the last one. How many moves to make the bottom one look like the top one? So if you're standing in the front, you would see everyone going. So the answer doesn't matter, but what you're doing is planning. You're saying, so if I do this, then I need to do that, and then I need to do this before I can do that, otherwise I won't be able to do. That's planning. And for many people with TSC, that's really, really hard. And so interventions for these things, I'm not going to talk about the detail, but the short answer is we don't just assess these things to assess them, we can intervene. For all these deficits that we've talked about, there are things we can do. There are some accommodations we can make. If people struggle, we can help them. And it's right to start with accommodations. There are some general strategies by which we're just going to reduce the load on the brain to make it easier for people to do these things. And we do it particularly by helping them practice to overlearn and make things as automatic as possible. It's like learning to drive a car. And then there are some skill-specific strategies for each of these things that I've mentioned. And in the interest of time, we're not going to have time to talk about it now, but I'm happy to talk about it during the break or in the afternoon if we have time. So just to end up on a word on where we are with research, people are very interested in, can we use mTOR inhibitors to treat TAND manifestations? You're going to hear this afternoon about some studies that have been done trying to address different medication approaches. We've also just finished a little pilot study in the UK, which Julian Sampson presented. And what we did was we used everolimus in adults with TSC who had neuropsychological deficits, like the ones I've just mentioned to you. And we had a placebo group, and we had people on everolimus. They were treated for 6 months. And the short answer, and our findings have literally just come out. We observed 2 things. First, that all people with TSC, even those who had placebo, showed significant gains just in learning because they've become familiar with what we're expecting. Perhaps they've become less anxious. They know what to expect. So just through learning effects, 44% of people in the study showed significant gains in their neuropsychological tests. So lesson number 1 for all of us, use the predictability, use the helping people settle in. Don't expect things to be happening the first time when most people with TSC might feel overwhelmed by task demands. So that's, I think, a really important clinical lesson. But the second observation, which we were very interested was, we also saw that in the people who took everolimus, 70% of the people in the trial showed significant improvements in their neuropsychological skills. So over and above the learning effects, we saw added value of everolimus to help people with these very specific deficits. They all had IQs of 60 or above, and they were all adults. So this is not just a potential treatment for very young children, and I think that's a very interesting challenge for us to look at further and to do more research on. Lots more work to do. We need to know more about drugs for TAND. We need to know more about non-drugs for TAND. People really want tools. They don't want us to count a number. They want us to do things and give them tools. And of course, then people want to know, how early can we start? Can I start training my child while they're in the womb, once I know they have TSC? Or can I give them drugs while they're inside my belly still? I'm going to stop. Poor Lucy, I've taken a lot of her time already. But really, just to end back with Lauren, I think part of the message for us today is not just to remember and celebrate all the great things and contributions that she's made to the field, but also I think as a reminder for all of us. She was 36, 2 beautiful children, highly successful, and I think the message to all of us is life is short and life is precious, and we never can predict when we might not have it anymore. And so I think that's just a way for all of us to focus on thinking what's important to me, what's important to us, what's wasting time, what's noise, and what are my priorities, and what are the important things in life. And I think it's something that I and my team and us as people who've worked with Lauren have really become aware of. And I think it's an important message because it's universal. And it applies to all of us, and it applies to all of you as well. So my wish for you for the day, even if you go away with nothing other than thinking life is short and let's make the best use of it, then I think we've done a good job today. I'm going to pause there and hand over to Lucy, who has to do a little computer switch.